What's up everybody? Welcome back to a brand new episode of Bonsai-U. In this episode we're going to be talking about Japanese flowering apricot or Prunus mume bonsai. So every week I get requests from people all over the world to cover different aspects of bonsai art and design, but the number one most requested subject is actually Prunus mume or Japanese flowering apricot bonsai. As of now, there's not really a lot of great information online or in books about how to create and maintain this species of bonsai, but it's one of those species that everybody seems to gravitate towards. If you've ever seen exhibition books in Japan, or if you've ever traveled to Japan, you'll know that at the Kokufuten, or the Japanese National Exhibition, this is one of those species that really stands out. It's actually one of the reasons why the Kokufu is held in early February every year. It's because these guys are in full bloom at that particular time. So you get the really interesting kind of craggly old bark of the tree, no leaves on the plant, and then beautiful dainty flowers. So the contrast between those beautiful flowers and the gnarly bark is really what is the draw, I think, to flowering apricot bonsai. At least that's what it is for me. In the minds of the Japanese, flowering apricot has a long history, and it's used as a motif quite often in different aspects of the culture. So while I was doing my apprenticeship for 6 years under Keiichi Fujikawa at Koken Nursery in Osaka, I got to work on some of the best flowering apricot bonsai in all of the world. We maintained a lot of those trees at the nursery for clients, but we also had special clients who would bring trees in, and we would work on those trees for those clients. Those clients would then take those trees back to their homes and display them. As a matter of fact, we had one customer in particular, Mr. Yanai, who was a restaurant owner in Osaka, and every year in February, he would put on an exhibition of his flowering apricot bonsai in the restaurant. And one year, Mr. Yanai invited me and, of course, Fujikawa-san and Fujikawa-san's mother to come see the exhibition and enjoy dinner at the restaurant. Now, this restaurant's a very special restaurant. It's known as a settai restaurant, which means it's usually a place where you take potential clients or business partners to kind of wine and dine them. So a typical meal there ranges somewhere between $300 to $500 per person. So very, very expensive. So it was an honor to get to be invited to go see the exhibition and, of course, partake in the food there. So while we were there, Mr. Yanai gave us a little tour of the restaurant, and I actually did a video on this a few years back, so I'll put a link in the description down below so you can see the full episode there. But I wanted to give you guys a little clip here of Mr. Yanai sort of describing his love for flowering apricot bonsai, and I think you might get a better understanding where my love of it comes from, and I think where most people's interest in flowering apricot bonsai comes from.
今一番ええ時は今20歳ぐらいですね。
これはしだれ梅言うて、まあまあ最近落ち着いてきて、もっと1年でこんな伸びよった。それが落ち着いてきて伸びんようになって、やっと一人前、うちの僕の盆栽の棚の中では俺の友達みたいな状態の育ち方したもんと、この向きがもうちょっと立っとったのもちょっと斜め下して植えたので、この木が引き立ったんじゃないかと思ってこれを作ったんやけどね。でもなかなか少ない木やし、この木の動きいうもんは、この動きだけは絶対作ろう思っても針金でもできへん。こんだけのもんを針金で作ることができないけれども、これをやっぱりこの前の持っとった人の時から僕はもう好きでたまらんで、欲しくて欲しくてしゃあなかったんけれども、そこまで盆栽の思いを思っとったら必ず自分のとこ入ってくるいうことを覚えた気がこれですわ、僕はね。でもこの幹肌とかこういうの花の色、このヒバイいうんかしだれ梅ではもう珍しい、この花の品格のある花の小さい、これも鉢は鉢で南蛮でややこしい鉢やけども、この鉢で生かしたり、この色は今羽の竹の色で、こんな竹の色は随分よく集めてるもんで、これも集めてるコレクションの中の一つ。以上。
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this particular tree right here and its history before we dive into the techniques for this tutorial. So this flowering apricot bonsai was grown by a friend of mine, John Wall, here in Nashville, Tennessee. He owns Turnbull Creek Bonsai on the west side of town, so I'll put a link in the description down below so you can check out his work. He grew this, I believe, from a cutting. I grew it in the ground for about 8 or 9 years. About 2 years ago, he dug it up, put it in an Anderson flat, and then about 1 year ago, I purchased it from him. So we let it grow all growing season last year, and then this spring we potted it up in this container right here. This is a Nakawatari container, which means it's an antique Chinese container made between the years 1800 and 1911. So it's a very, very old pot. This pot was actually given to me as a gift from Mr. Fujikawa when I left Japan several years ago. About 3 years ago when I came back, he gave me a few pots, and this was part of that pot collection. So this pot and this tree are going to remain in my private collection here at Eisei-en going forward. So again, we potted this up just a few weeks ago here, I guess probably early March or so, early to mid-March, so about a month and a half ago. And the tree, you can see, has exploded with growth. All of this extension growth right here has occurred in the last month and a half. None of this stuff was available back in March. So this is actually the perfect time of year to be diving into the technique we're going to be talking about today, and that is something called Partial Outer Canopy Defoliation. Okay, so Partial Outer Canopy Defoliation, what is it? Well, the name sort of describes basically what it is. We're going to be removing about 80 to 90% of the total foliage mass on the outer canopy of the tree, leaving the inner weaker growth alone. We're not going to cut the leaves off on the interior of the plant. So this provides several benefits in the development of a flowering apricot bonsai. First and foremost, number one, when we remove the leaves on a tree like this, you're going to get a second flush of growth in the next 2 to 3 weeks. That second flush of growth will be smaller, so you have smaller leaves, which looks nicer. That's also going to produce softer branch ramification. It's going to produce more ramification on the tree, so more branching on the plant. You're going to get twice as many branches on the plant in a single growing season than you would if you just left the tree alone to grow. And then the final thing is that by leaving the internal growth completely alone, we're allowing light and air to penetrate to those areas, strengthen the internal areas, and then that way we get more back budding on the plant. We keep the back buds that are already there alive and healthy. That way it has, again, more ramification, and in the future, as this tree elongates and grows out of the desired profile, we have something to cut back to. So we've got lots of benefits in doing partial outer canopy defoliation. Now, the reason I wouldn't want to do 100% total defoliation on a flowering apricot, or really any tree, is because those buds and leaves that are on the interior of the plant right now, they're already weak. So if I were to defoliate those and remove those leaves, they may not flush out again, and we might end up killing those internal buds and branches on the tree. So we're going to be doing partial outer canopy defoliation, or as we like to call it here at Eisei-en, POCD, not COPD. Just keep that in mind, POCD, partial outer canopy defoliation. So I'm gonna bring the camera in a little bit closer and show you what this looks like, what the process is like, and then we're gonna get into the styling of this tree once we defoliate it. All right, so let's take a look at this shoot right here. This is a shoot coming out of the right side of the tree here. Again, all of this growth was produced just in the last month and a half here or so. So the tree's growing very, very vigorously. And I want you to keep in mind that I did not fertilize this tree in the spring as the new leaves were flushing out. It hasn't had any fertilizer whatsoever so far. And that's for a couple of reasons. Number one, if we fertilize, particularly if we use a high nitrogen fertilizer, you're going to get very, very long internodes. So the distance between each leaf will be extended. That's going to look very unseemly and unsightly when we're trying to develop tight ramification on the tree. So of course we don't want to fertilize in the spring because of that. The second thing is that, again, a high nitrogen fertilizer is going to produce massive leaves. Now that's really not that big a deal because we're going to be defoliating this anyway, and it's going to be producing a smaller second flush of growth. But the main thing here, again, is the long internodes. We want tight, small internodes, so this tree has had no fertilizer this spring at all. So as part of this process, what we're going to do here is actually start at the very tip of the shoot here, and we're going to remove all of these leaves back to the interior back here. So essentially the way this works is we want to cut through the petiole, which is basically the area between the leaf and the actual shoot itself. So this little bitty stem right here, that's the petiole. So we're cutting that essentially right in half and leaving the other half intact on the shoot. At the base of this petiole right here, there's actually a little bitty bud that's a dormant bud. So by cutting off the leaf here, cutting the petiole in half, that will then activate that latent bud right there, and it will produce a new branch on the tree. So that's how we're able to get, twice as much branch ramification on the plant in a single growing season. So we're gonna take all of these leaves off on the outside here. Now this shoot's a little bit long, so I'm just gonna go ahead and take off the terminal end here as well. We're gonna continue to cut these off all the way back down to the interior of the tree here. Okay, and we're gonna leave the leaves on the interior back here intact. So I'll zoom in at the end so you can see exactly which leaves we're leaving on the interior and which ones are taking off on the exterior here. But just know this is the process. We're cutting the petioles in half and we're leaving all of these shoots long right now so that when we apply wire to them, we have lots of options in terms of placing them, and then we may cut some of those back to a desired profile. One thing I want to mention here is that the timing of performing this technique is quite important. So you don't want to be doing POCD on the tree too early in the growing season. You want to let the new shoots elongate. You want to let the new growth essentially harden off, which means that the sort of texture and color of the leaf will actually change. So if you notice here at the very, very end of the shoot, we still have these very, very young sort of fleshy leaves here, but the further back down we go on the branch, the darker the leaves become and the sort of harder they become. They kind of lose that kind of velvety look to them that you get out here, and they look just a little bit more hardened off. So this is the stage or the point at which you would want to perform partial outer canopy defoliation on the tree, not really any earlier than this in the growing season. And again, if you wait too late in the growing season, you could potentially lose a lot of that interior growth here because it will be shaded out by the exterior growth. And also the strength of the exterior growth is pulling energy out and away, again, because these trees want to grow up and out. So you may end up losing some of that interior growth. So it's a bit of a balancing act in terms of when to perform this, but as a general rule of thumb here in Tennessee and in Osaka, in Japan, we would perform this technique, or we do perform this technique in early to mid-May, maybe even as far back as late May, but I wouldn't go beyond that into the growing season. So again, just after the leaves harden off, within a week or two of that, you're good to go to perform this technique. So here's a close-up of the interior of the first branch here. You can see the elongating shoot here. We've defoliated it all the way back down to the base here. But this little extra shoot back here, this sort of tertiary branch a little further back down, I've left that one intact. So this is what you want to be looking for when you're leaving internal growth on the tree. You want to remove all of the growth on the extended shoots all the way back down to the base. But if there are secondary or tertiary branches further back down, further back in, those that are weaker, that aren't elongating, these are the types of growth that you want to leave on the tree. You don't want to defoliate these. Okay, so before we jump into wiring and styling this tree, there's one last thing I want to cover with you, and that is, when should you not perform POCD on a flowering apricot? Well, if the tree is weak or very, very old and not throwing out elongating shoot growth in the spring, I would not recommend that you do this technique. You need to see at least 6 to 8 leaves on each shoot before you perform POCD on a tree like this. Otherwise, you may end up killing the branch back on the plant. So one cool thing about flowering apricots though is as they get very, very old and start to peter out in terms of their health, you can actually scion graft younger foliage, younger branches back on the tree and essentially reinvigorate the plant. And then you can start defoliating the tree again. So it's a really cool regenerative process, and it's really only exclusive to flowering apricots. At some point, of course, they are going to peter out once they get to usually about 125 years old, 150 years old. That's when they really start petering out and there's not much you can do at that point. But 70, 80, 90 years old, as they slow down, you can start grafting on them again and repeat this process. So it's a really, really cool thing. We actually had a few trees at Fujikawa-san's nursery that we did that to, and we were able to take trees that had no ramification or branches that had died off and reinvigorate them and produce a fully ramified tree in about 6 to 8 years. So it's a very quick process with flowering apricots. Okay, now that we've got the sort of general idea about POCD down, we're gonna wire and style this tree. So wiring and styling flowering apricots, this is the perfect time to do it because the branches are very, very flexible. If you wire these trees really any other time of the year, you'll know they snap very easily. They give you no sign of tearing, or maybe they might snap, they just break right in half. So this time of year is actually perfect to do this kind of work. And we're gonna be using aluminum or aluminium wire, for those of you in the rest of the world outside of the United States, to apply to this tree and set the branches. So we're gonna start with the first lowest directional branch here first, and then work our way up, and I'll explain the process as we go. Okay, so on our first branch right here, this is going to be our directional branch. We actually did POCD to this particular branch last year, which is why it has way more ramification than the branches up at the top here. So it's going to be a little bit more involved in terms of wiring and styling this branch. You can actually see a little bit of wire scarring right here on this branch, which is actually not that big a deal. This is going to heal over the next couple of years and actually bark up relatively quickly, but I wouldn't want to let the wire bite in anywhere beyond what we did last year. So just a tiny bit of biting in is fine, not really an issue. So we're going to start with this branch and then work our way up, but the issue is I can't just wire from the first bifurcation here out, because these guys are just going to teeter-totter here. So we're actually going to anchor this branch up and around up to probably the apex or our back branch back here. So I'm going to take the wire in the same direction as we had the original wire here, so that if it does, for example, happen to bite in one more time, it's not going to kill the branch. If it's going the opposite direction, so this one right here was going clockwise, if we apply this counterclockwise and it bites in again, it may end up killing the branch. So of course we definitely don't want that to happen here. So we're going to start back on the interior here, and the pitch of the wire that I'm going to be using on this tree is actually going to be closer to a 45, maybe even a little tighter than a 45, and that is because these branches tend to be somewhat brittle even at this stage, at this time of year, relatively speaking, at least relative to a conifer branch. So a slightly tighter pitch is definitely going to help with that and give us a little bit more support. Now the size wire that I'm using for this is a 3mm diameter here, and we're actually going to be doubling up on this. So I treat these the same way I would a piece of coniferous material as well, in terms of using a slightly smaller gauge of wire and then doubling up rather than trying to crank on a really thick, heavy-duty piece of wire, because you may end up slipping or cracking the branch as you go if you apply wire that's too thick. So this is a good alternative and a bit of a safer method, I think, than applying a heavy-duty wire. All right, now that we've got the first wire on here, we're going to come back to that first bifurcation, which is back here with these two branches. And the initial wire that we put on is actually going to be our anchor now for the secondary wire. So we're going to wire this out onto this branch here, and that should hold relatively well. Okay, so now that we have the entire tree wired here all the way out to essentially the tertiary branches, I know the upper portion of the tree isn't very well ramified, so it's mainly just primary branches, but again, down here on this first directional branch, we defoliated that one last year, so we do actually have some secondary and tertiary branches, so I wired all of those out. So what I want to do next is guy wire this first branch down and in towards the interior a little bit here to draw your eye back basically towards the interesting curves in the trunk, because the trunk really is sort of the main feature of this tree. And as this tree gets older and older, the bark on that trunk will start to crack up and look very gnarly, which is one of those main characteristics of flowering apricot bonsai that make them so cool. So we're going to be using a size 20 gauge wire here to guy wire this first directional branch down and in. So I'm going to meet the two ends of this on top of the wrapped wire here, and we're going to pull and twist with the gin pliers. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind when you're designing deciduous material is that we don't want the branches to look like a pine or a conifer. So we're not looking really to create necessarily full pads. What we want to do is fan everything out like a hand to begin with, and then we're going to offset things on the z-axis basically. So it's got variations in volume up and down. So I'm going to be extra careful here in pulling this branch down, because as I said before, flowering apricots really give you no warning if they're going to snap. All right, that feels pretty good right there. See if we can go just a little further. Okay, so now that we have the branch kind of down in the right tentative spot here, I want to start setting the structure of the primary branches, secondary branches, and tertiary branches here. So if you notice, we've got the first bifurcation on this branch right here. What I don't want to do is level these out on the same plane. I actually kind of like basically where they are. I want to be able to see each individual secondary branch and tertiary branch. That's going to give us a feeling that it has a lot more ramification. Whereas if we were to put it on a flat sort of horizontal plane, you lose a lot of that volume. So with deciduous trees, we want a lot of upward, downward, side to side motion, and then of course the very tips of the branches, we want to lift those up just slightly, somewhat similar to a conifer in that regard. All right, now this one is a little straight through here, so we're going to raise it up slightly, back down a little bit more, up again, down again, and out. All right, and I've left all of these extra long, like we talked about in the beginning. This makes it a little bit easier to wire, set the branches, and then we can always cut each of those branches back to the correct profile once we've got them in the right spot. So while this branch here that we just set is technically our lowest branch, it's not really the directional branch of the tree. The directional branch is actually this guy off to the far left side here. Now, typically when you're designing a tree, particularly a conifer, we tend to have the first directional branch be the lowest branch and then it stair steps back up and in. But with this one, I'm not really concerned about doing that. I actually like the idea of keeping this a little bit higher up here and having it stair step down towards the interior rather than towards the exterior here. So this branch essentially is going to stay where it is. We're just going to bring it a little bit tighter to the side here, and then we're going to position these secondary and tertiary branches in a similar fashion to what we did with that internal branch right there. All right, so a little bit of up and down motion, side to side motion. But again, we don't want to create just a hand shape like a fan. We want that Z-axis, so the volume this direction up and down to be quite full. And I really want to be able to see each individual secondary and tertiary branch. All right, so don't be afraid with a branch like this to take it up and then down and out. It doesn't need to fan out like a hand, like I said. So the next step here, we're going to set the branches on the right side of the tree. We need a counterbalance to the lean of the plant to the left here. So these elongating branches here are going to do just the trick here to help us out with that. So again, I want to take the branches up and then down and out. So you'll notice here coming right out of the trunk, the first portion of the branch actually rises up. So I'm going to continue that line just a little bit more with each of these secondary branches here. And then we're going to start to drop the ends down a little bit. Again, these branches are not nearly as ramified as that first directional branch because we didn't defoliate it last year. This is the first year that we've done that. So it's going to look a little bit strange on the upper portion of the tree relative to the lower portion, but over the course of this growing season, that will balance itself out a little bit. This is the perfect time as well to over-exaggerate the movement because these are brand new shoots and they're relatively flexible. They'll never be this flexible again. So we might as well over-exaggerate it a little bit because this wire will come off relatively soon, obviously before it bites in. So we want to make sure to overcompensate to some degree because those branches will sort of revert back somewhat to their original positioning, meaning they'll elongate and stretch a little bit and become a little bit straighter. So we overcompensate by putting some extra motion in them at this point. You'll notice from the side view of the tree here as well, we've got nothing to the back and down in this area. So we're going to be lowering these branches in a similar manner here. Again, keeping it consistent with that type of motion, up and down, side to side, back and forth, and then of course lifting at the end. And again, keep in mind, we're going to go through and shorten some of these at the very end of this demonstration back to the proper profile here. So don't be alarmed that they're so long at this particular point. All right, so let's address the apex of the tree now. So I put wire obviously on the tallest shoot here. I just wired everything out to begin with. But now that we've set a majority of the other branches on the tree, it's looking like this is actually going to be way too tall for the plant. As a matter of fact, the last sort of stretch here of the main portion of the trunk is quite straight and there's very little taper in there. So I'm thinking that the best option here is actually going to be to eliminate this completely and utilize one of these smaller branches a little further back down to create the new apex on the tree. It'll give it more dynamic movement, better taper, and it'll look better in the long run, despite the fact that we're having to cut off, a pretty significant branch at this particular point. So let's go ahead and chop this back, and then we're going to set the apex, add some motion to it, and then we'll go back through and cut back the shoots that are still too long on the tree. All right, so this is the final product for this iteration with this particular flowering apricot or Prunus Ume Bonsai. As I said before, the lower branch is way more ramified than the upper portion of the tree, but by the time we get to the end of this growing season, they should have balanced out to some degree. They'll look a little bit more similar to one another. Now, what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks is obviously we're going to get a second flush of growth. And during that period, as that new flush of growth is coming out, what I want to do is actually put this tree in morning sun and then afternoon shade. The reason being is that all of these little inner leaves that we've left alone on the tree, those were previously shaded out. So if we were to put this directly back out into the hot sun, those inner branches would likely fry. So we want to make sure that we're providing a little bit of afternoon protection from the sun. Again, this tree is also not going to be fertilized until this next flush of growth comes out and completely hardens off. So that should be around 4 to 5 weeks from now. Then we'll start the fertilization process. We will not defoliate this tree again this year. We only do this once per year. And if the tree is healthy, you can do this year after year after year. Again, if the tree is putting out shoots that are 6 to 8 leaves long or even longer, you can defoliate the tree in that year. Another thing to consider too is that since we defoliated the tree, it's going to absorb or take up a lot less water over the next week or so until the new leaves start to come out. Once the new leaves start to come out, it's like spring all over again for the tree. So it's going to start sucking up a lot more moisture up into the plant to produce that new flush of growth. So you're going to have to adjust your watering if you're applying this to your tree. Just know it's going to stop taking up water for about a week and then start up again. The final thing here is that the wire on this tree, we're going to take this wire off somewhere in the next probably 2 to 6 weeks. It doesn't stay on very long. It all depends on how quickly those branches thicken up and that wire bites in. Again, we don't really want any biting into the branch if possible, or bare minimum biting in, because you'll always be able to see those wire scars. So keep that in mind with your trees. You're going to have to constantly keep an eye on them. Every time you go out and water the tree, just look up underneath the branches and see if that wire is biting in. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Bonsai-U, and I hope that this answered a lot of your questions regarding Japanese flowering apricot bonsai. I want to thank you guys for checking out this episode, and if you guys really like what we do here, make sure to like and subscribe down below. And if you really want to support us, please click on the link in the description down below. It'll bounce you over to my website and you can make a donation to help Bonsai-U going forward. We do all the production here in-house. I film, edit, produce, write, all of this stuff myself. So it's a lot of work, and we really appreciate all of you guys who have donated so far. And we want to thank you guys for all of your continued support. Till next time, take care.